With President-elect Trump taking office on Monday, Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas is preparing to step down after 4 years in his role. Secretary Mayorkas joins us now. A lot to talk about these last 4 years. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us. You know, I would start with, and we could talk about what you think you accomplished, but I would start with something that's maybe more complicated, which is, were there things that you either wished you could have accomplished or, frankly, had done differently? And the reason I ask is because I wonder whether some of the issues around the border and other things ultimately led actually to Vice President Harris losing to now President Trump.
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me. I'm not sure I'm in a position to agree or disagree with your political conclusion as to what determined the election in November. There are different views having been expressed. I wish that we had more time, and that would enable us to do more, not only in furtherance of our mission, but in the service of the American people. And I don't tend to look back like that. I look forward and see what is ahead and what can be ahead for the benefit of the American people.
Well, let me ask, talking about looking ahead, there's a big issue on the table, and that is H-1B visas, and how you think visas in this country should be approached, what we need to do, how we need to work it. And obviously there's even a divide, forget about inside the Democratic side of the aisle, but there's a divide inside the Republican side of the aisle about this.
Yes, it's a very interesting issue, the high-skilled labor visa under H-1B. There is bipartisan support and bipartisan opposition. I think it is a vitally important visa program. I think our country actually has a visa system that is way outdated and is not tied to market needs. If we look north to Canada, what Canada does is calibrate the number of economic visas it will issue each year according to the market needs that year. We have numeric caps on our economic visas that were set in the 1990s. That is just unproductive.
Do you think that's fixable? I mean, do you think politically there's a will for that to fix that then?
I think there's a political will. The question is there a political ability? Everything, as you well know, and I think everyone understands, everything involved in immigration is rather electric and quite divisive. But really, this is a matter of economic prosperity. The visa programs, whether it's the H-1B, whether it's the agricultural worker visa program, whether it's the temporary unskilled labor visa program, these are meant to fuel the American economy. We need additional workers to fill jobs that Americans do not fill for a variety of reasons. Right. And we need to fix this broken immigration system, including the economic visa program within it.
But, Mr. Secretary, do you not, I mean, put the politics of the election aside if you want. Do you not look at the immigration issue in this country and what has transpired over the last 4 years, given the number of people coming into this country illegally, given the firestorm that this has created, the national dialogue about it, given some of the efforts, frankly, by the administration, especially early on, to be more lenient than they had been? Do you think none of those things, if you could go back, you would do differently?
Look, Andrew, yes, and you have to understand something. And this is not specific to government, but to any large organization, including a government administration. People have different views on what the correct policies should be, what the correct operational measures should be. Those disagreements, those different views are voiced, decisions are made, and then everyone marches in unity together. That is the nature of a large organization, and the government is no different.
But just so I'm clear, are you suggesting your own personal views about how to operate this were at odds, or there was a distinction between your personal approach and how you would have wanted to do it and how maybe your bosses wanted to do it?
I don't want to get into the deliberative process. We're one team and it's one effort, but this is not a revolutionary concept that there are disparate views when one has many people involved in the decision-making process.
That was exactly, Mr. Secretary, where the line of questioning where I was going to go, and Andrew effectively asked what I would have asked, because there's a couple of things. All you got to do, any AI program, just say what of the very first, and it was exactly 4 years ago, the very first executive orders that were reversed, which one of them, or list 4 or 5 that exacerbated the problem and allowed, basically quadrupled the number of illegal crossings. And you indicated to me that you maybe wouldn't have halted remain in Mexico, wouldn't have paused the border wall construction, wouldn't have relaxed deportation priorities, wouldn't have rescinded the public charge rule. You were just, I would say that. Were you just following the orders from the people above you? I'd pass the buck if I were you, because it turned into an S show, the whole thing. I mean, it quadrupled to almost 12 million versus 3 million illegal crossings.
A couple things. First of all, I'm not a pass the buck guy.
I would.
That's not a hold on. That's not a noble approach to service. Number one. Number two, let's place the challenge of immigration that this country has faced in context, and that's in a global context, because what we experienced at our southern border was not exclusive to our southern border. It is a phenomenon that many countries around the world, not only in our hemisphere, experienced, because we have had the largest level of displacement in the world since World War II. And so the challenge of migration started well before this administration. In 2018, our border experienced approximately 560,000 individuals encountered. In 2019, that number almost doubled. And so the trend was underway in terms of the level of displacement that is mirrored in other parts of the world as well. And then the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and that, of course, materially impacted people's decisions as to whether they could leave their countries of origin and migrate elsewhere.
Mr. Secretary, let me ask you a strategic question. So we have heard from President-elect Trump some very loud and specific rhetoric aimed at Mexico, the leaders of Mexico, aimed at the leaders of Canada, about the help that he believes they should be implementing to help the United States prevent illegal immigration. My question to you is, how much of the problem lies with Mexico or lies with Canada? How much of it lies with what we're doing on our end? If you were to create a pie chart and sort of assign effectively responsibilities to these things, because I think there's a real question of how much it's going to ultimately cost us and what kind of procedures we need to put in place to make all of this happen.
It's a really important question. And I think every country has a significant role to play in managing migration. It is not up to one country, and I have said this for many a year, that if our border is the first line of defense, it is too late. And let me share with you a very powerful example of that. In December of 2023, we experienced the highest level of encounters of any one month, I think potentially in our history and certainly in the past 20 years. What happened in December was that the Mexican Enforcement Agency was unfunded. And so there was no interdiction effort. And we saw trains coming to the border carrying thousands of individuals. You may recall that President Biden then spoke with President Lopez Obrador at that time, and then dispatched Secretary Blinken and me to Mexico to explain what the problem was and what we needed Mexico to do in partnership with us. President Lopez Obrador took action, refunded the enforcement agency, and in January, the numbers plummeted. And that's an example of the importance of interdiction of another country enforcing its laws before individuals arrive at our border. So it is a shared responsibility.
Mr. Secretary, let me leave you with one other question, which is because a lot of Americans, to the degree they come into contact with Homeland Security, they come into contact through the TSA at airports. And recently, we've heard all of these very unusual stories of people boarding planes that shouldn't have been allowed to board planes, people who have gotten into wheelbases of airplanes, all sorts of very unusual things happening. How should we think about the security at airports today? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it airport theater? I think there's a lot of other questions about it.
It is very strong, and I will say that when millions of passengers fly every day across the United States and across the world, people who come into airports now do not think about whether they will arrive safely at their place of destination, which was indeed the case years ago. They now are thinking about how easy and comfortable their travel will be. There indeed have been a few cases of individuals becoming stowaways, which is a security lapse. And it is security, again, is a shared responsibility. Certainly, it is shouldered by TSA. It is also shouldered by the airports and the airlines. Here again, it is a partnership that drives security, and we have to keep that in mind in every aspect of the work of the Department of Homeland Security.